Hey, darkness seekers. If you think you know Appalachia, think again. These mountains hold secrets darker than the deepest coal mine, stories that have been whispered in forgotten hollows for generations. What I'm about to share isn't just another horror story. These are fragments of truth so chilling, they'll make your blood run cold. But here's the thing. These stories are more than just tales. They're warnings, passed down through generations, waiting to be heard. And now, they're your responsibility. Subscribe to Verified Fears right now. Hit that notification bell, because every view, every share is a promise. A promise that these voices won't be silenced again. That the truth, no matter how horrifying, will be remembered. If you're brave enough to face the darkness that lurks in the forgotten corners of Appalachia, prove it. Drop a comment with your own family's darkest secret. Share this video with someone who thinks they've heard it all. Some stories are waiting to hunt you, and today you're going to listen. Let's uncover the truth. Let's dive into our first story, a tale so deeply rooted in the blood-soaked soil of Appalachia that it will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, survival, and the darkness that lurks beneath generational trauma. The story begins long before Elizabeth Rowland drew her first breath, in the merciless landscape of Harlan County, Kentucky, a place where mountains don't just stand as silent witnesses, but active participants in a generational saga of survival, violence, and unspoken revenge. To understand Elizabeth's story, we must first understand the land that birthed her, a terrain as unforgiving as the history that carved its valleys and peaks. Harlan County in the early 1930s was not a place for the weak. It was a battleground, where coal companies waged war against the very people who risked their lives extracting black gold from the earth's depths. The mountains themselves seemed to breathe with a mixture of coal dust, desperation, and an ancient, smoldering rage that would be passed down through generations like a cursed inheritance. The Rowland family had been mountain people for as long as anyone could remember. They weren't just residents of these mountains, they were part of its very fabric. Thomas Rowland, Elizabeth's father, came from a long line of miners who understood that each day underground could be their last. His grandfather had been killed. In a mining accident, his father had lost 2 fingers to a cave-in, and Thomas himself bore scars that told stories of survival against impossible odds. But 1932 was different. This was the year of the Harlan County Coal Wars, a period so brutal that it would be remembered as one of the most violent labor conflicts in American history. The miners were fighting for more than just better wages or safer working conditions. They were fighting for their very right to exist, to be treated as human beings in a system that saw them as nothing more than disposable labor. Thomas Rowland wasn't just a miner. He was a union organizer, a dangerous position that made him a target for both the coal company's hired guns and local law enforcement. His wife, Margaret, knew the risks better than anyone. She had watched her own father be beaten within an inch of his life for speaking out against the company's inhuman practices. She knew that resistance came with a price paid in blood. Their daughter Elizabeth was born into this crucible of violence. From her earliest memories, she understood that survival was not a given, but a constant negotiation. The stories told around their kerosene lamp were not fairy tales, but survival manuals, accounts of resistance, of holding on to dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. The violence wasn't abstract, it was immediate, visceral. Elizabeth remembered the night when company men came to their home, their boots leaving mud and what looked like dried blood on the wooden floor. Her father stood tall, but she could see the tremor in his hands, the way her mother's fingers dug into the windowsill, creating half-moon marks in the wood. What made the Rowland family different was something deeper than mere resistance. There was a darkness in their lineage, an understanding that some injustices cannot be solved through legal means or peaceful protest. The mountains had taught them that revenge was not just a possibility, but sometimes a necessity. Margaret would often tell Elizabeth stories that seemed like more than just family history, tales of other mining families who had disappeared, of company men who met strange, unexplained ends. These weren't just stories. They were a kind of oral history, a secret language of survival that had been passed down through generations of Roland women. As Elizabeth grew older, she began to understand the true nature of her family's legacy. The journal her father kept was more than just a record of events. It was a detailed account of every injustice, every life taken, every family destroyed by the coal companies. But it was also something else, something that hinted at a form of retribution that went beyond traditional understanding of justice. The massacre that had claimed so many lives, including members of their extended family, was not just a historical event for the Rolands. It was a living, breathing wound that demanded to be addressed, and the women of the family were its keepers, its instruments. Margaret's whispers became more cryptic as the years passed. "The mountains remember," she would say, "and what the mountains remember they eventually collect." Elizabeth didn't fully understand these words then, but she would. Oh, she would. The coal company thought they could break people. They thought their money, their guns, their political connections made them untouchable. They didn't understand the kind of memory that lived in these mountains. They didn't understand the Roland women. What happened next would become a legend whispered in the hollows of Harlan County, a story of revenge so profound, so meticulously planned, that it would transform from a family's personal vendetta into something that would make even the most hardened souls shudder. Because in these mountains, justice is not given, it is taken, and the Roland women knew exactly how to take what was owed. Some stories are meant to be told, some are meant to be lived, and some are meant to hunt. And this is one of those stories. Let's dive into our second story, a descent into the darkest corners of human survival, where the line between desperation and madness blurs like morning mist over the Appalachian peaks. This is a tale of moonshine, survival, and the spirits that hunt those who dare to disturb the mountain's secrets. The year was 1927, and Prohibition had turned the mountains of West Virginia into a treacherous landscape of survival and opportunity. Samuel Thornton wasn't born a bootlegger. He was born into a legacy of survival that ran deeper than the coal seams and darker than the moonshine that would become his inheritance. The Thornton family had been mountain people for generations. They weren't criminals, they were survivors. In these mountains, survival was an art form passed down through blood and whispered stories. Samuel's grandfather had learned to distill liquor during the Civil War, a skill that kept his family alive when everything else had been stripped away. His father had continued the tradition, turning their remote mountain property into a lifeline during the worst of times. When Samuel inherited the family's isolated mountain property, he didn't see it as a burden. He saw it as a responsibility. The still house wasn't just a building. It was a testament to generations of Thornton resilience. Nestled deep in a hollow so remote that even local maps seemed to forget its existence, the property was more than just a place. It was a world unto itself. The first few months weren't easy. Bootlegging during Prohibition was a dangerous game. It wasn't just about avoiding federal agents. It was about navigating a complex network of local alliances, territorial disputes, and mountain politics that ran deeper than most could comprehend. Samuel quickly learned that success wasn't about making the best moonshine. It was about understanding the unspoken rules of mountain survival. His first batches were rough, the kind of liquor that could strip paint or kill a man if he wasn't careful. But Samuel was a quick learner. He found his grandfather's old recipe, books, pages stained with what looked like dried blood and whiskey, filled with instructions that were part chemistry, part folklore. These weren't just recipes. They were survival manuals, written in invisible ink of family secrets. The mountains seemed to watch him as he worked. On the clearest nights, Samuel would catch glimpses of something moving between the trees, shadows that didn't quite move like animals, shapes that disappeared before he could focus his eyes. The old-timers in the nearby town spoke about the hollow in whispers. They said some places were older than the mountains themselves, with memories that ran deeper than human understanding, Samuel's first real test came during a particularly harsh winter. Supplies were running low and competition from other bootleggers was becoming more aggressive. He started hearing stories, rumors about rival moonshiners who had disappeared, their stills found abandoned, with strange markings carved into the surrounding trees. The night everything changed was unlike any other. A storm rolled in, not just a mountain storm, but something that felt alive. The wind moved differently, carrying sounds that weren't quite human. Whispers, fragments of conversations, the kind of sounds that make a man question his sanity. His first indication that something was wrong came when he found strange markings around his still house. They weren't random. They were deliberate, symbols that looked older than any language he recognized. Some carved into trees, others etched into the ground around his property. Samuel knew enough about mountain folklore to understand that some things were better left undisturbed, but survival had never been about making the safe choice. It had always been about making the necessary choice. As weeks passed, Samuel began to notice changes. Small at first. A tool would be in a different place. Footprints around the still house that didn't match his own. Bottles of moonshine that seemed to have been moved, their contents slightly altered. He started keeping a journal, documenting these strange occurrences. The pages became a mixture of inventory logs, personal reflections, and something that looked increasingly like a descent into paranoia. The local community was no help. Some seemed to know something, their eyes holding a mixture of fear and something else, a kind of resigned understanding. When Samuel would ask about the strange occurrences, he'd get nothing more than cryptic responses. Some things are better left alone, they'd say. The mountains provide, but they also take. His moonshine. Business continued, but something had changed. Each batch seemed to carry a different weight, a different essence. Travelers who bought his liquor would return with strange stories, nights of vivid hallucinations, memories that felt both impossibly distant and unnervingly immediate. Samuel knew he was part of something larger, something that predated his family, something that was written into the very landscape of the mountains. The still house was more than a business. It was a ritual, a negotiation with something that existed beyond human understanding. As winter turned to spring, the line between reality and something else began to blur. Samuel would wake to find his journal filled with writing he didn't remember. Recipes that seemed to call for more than just corn and sugar. Instructions that hinted at a process of distillation that went beyond mere alcohol production. The spirits hunting Samuel were not the kind that could be exorcised with a priest or a prayer. They were older, deeper, connected to the very soil of the mountain, to generations of survival, to a type of knowledge that existed before written language. Some stories are meant to be told, some are meant to be survived, and some are meant to consume you, and this is one of those stories. Let's dive into our third story, a tale that will make you question the very boundaries of human survival, medical ethics, and the terrifying lengths a community will go to preserve its existence. This is not just a story. This is a nightmare, etched into the genetic code of an entire forgotten population. Dr. Margaret Harding was not the type of researcher who accepted easy answers. When she first arrived in the remote hollow of eastern Kentucky in 1958, she believed she was conducting a routine medical survey. What she would uncover was a truth so profound, so horrifying, that it would challenge everything she understood about human adaptation, survival, and the darkest corners of medical mystery. The region was unlike anywhere she had ever studied. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, this particular hollow seemed to exist outside of time. The community was isolated, not just geographically, but in every conceivable way. Census records were incomplete. Medical histories were fragmented. It was as if this place existed in a deliberate blind spot of modern documentation. Her initial research began innocently enough. A grant from a prestigious medical research institute had brought her to this remote location to study what appeared to be a cluster of unusual genetic disorders. But clusters suggest randomness. What Margaret would discover was anything but random. The first warning signs came during her initial medical examinations. The physical characteristics of the community's residents were subtle at first. Slight variations in bone structure, unusual pigmentation, respiratory adaptations that seemed to defy medical understanding. But it was the genetic testing that would reveal the true horror. Genetic markers that should have been impossible were not just present, they were consistent. Across multiple generations, across seemingly unrelated family lines, a pattern emerged that defied every principle of genetic variation Margaret had ever studied. It was as if the entire community shared a fundamental genetic modification that went beyond mere hereditary traits. The older residents spoke in riddles when she asked about their history. "We are what we needed to become," one elderly woman told her, her eyes holding a wisdom that seemed to predate modern medical understanding. "The mountain provides, the mountain protects." These were not just words, they were a statement of a terrifying biological truth. Margaret's background in genetic research had prepared her for anomalies, but nothing could have prepared her for what she would uncover in this forgotten hollow. The medical records she collected told a story of impossible survival. Genetic mutations that should have been fatal were not just survived, they were integrated, adapted, transformed into a means of continuation. Interviews with community elders revealed fragments of a darker narrative, stories of severe environmental challenges, of generations forced to survive in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. But survival, they explained, was not about maintaining the old form. It was about becoming something new. The children of the Hollow were particularly fascinating and terrifying. Physical examinations revealed respiratory systems that seemed adapted to low-oxygen environments, skeletal structures that suggested a deliberate evolutionary response to extreme geological conditions, metabolic processes that defied standard medical understanding. What Margaret was witnessing was not a medical anomaly. It was a deliberate, generations-long process of biological adaptation. The community had not just survived, they had transformed. As she delved deeper, the true nature of their survival became apparent. This was not a passive adaptation. It was an active, intentional process of genetic modification. Generations of careful, calculated breeding. Selective reproduction that went far beyond simple natural selection. The most chilling revelation came from the community's medical records, careful documentation of births, deaths, marriages, not as historical records, but as part of a meticulously planned genetic strategy. Children with specific genetic markers were cultivated. Those who did not meet the community's genetic requirements were systematically removed from the reproductive pool. Margaret began to understand that she was not just studying a community. She was witnessing the active creation of a new form of human existence, a deliberate, generational project of biological engineering that had been ongoing for decades, perhaps even centuries. The older members of the community began to speak more openly as she gained their trust. They talked about survival, not just as individuals, but as a collective biological entity. The mountain was not just their home, it was their laboratory, their incubator. "We choose what we become," one elder told her, his eyes holding a mixture of pride and something darker. "The outside world sees weakness. We see opportunity." Her research notes became increasingly fragmented, observations mixed with personal reflections, medical data intertwined with what almost seemed like field notes from a horror novel. The line between scientific documentation and something more primal began to blur. The community's survival mechanism was more than just genetic adaptation. It was a complete reimagining of human biological potential. Respiratory systems that could extract oxygen from environments that would kill a normal human. Metabolic processes that could sustain life under conditions that should have been fatal. But adaptation requires sacrifice, and the price of survival is always higher than it first appears. As Margaret's research progressed, she realized she was no longer just an observer. She had become a participant in a story far older and more complex than she could have ever imagined. Some stories are meant to be uncovered, Some truths are meant to remain hidden, and some revelations are so profound, they change everything we understand about what it means to be human. And this is one of those stories. Let's dive into our fourth story, a tale that will make you understand that some memories are not just remembered, but lived. Some lands do not just hold history, they hunger for justice. This is a story about inheritance, about lands that remember, and about the terrifying price of forgetting. Jacob Miller was not born to be a keeper of secrets. He was a farmer, a man whose roots in the Smoky Mountains ran as deep as the oldest trees, as ancient as the stones that formed the landscape. But roots, as Jacob would learn, are more than just connections to the land. They are conduits of memory, of pain, of a revenge that transcends generations. The Miller family's history was intimately tied to these mountains long before the first European settlers carved their way through the dense forests. Jacob's ancestors were Cherokee, part of a people who had been systematically removed, murdered, and forgotten. The land remembered what history books tried to erase. His grandmother had been the first to speak openly about their family's true history. Not the sanitized version taught in schools, but the raw, bleeding truth of displacement, of genocide masked as progress. She would tell Jacob stories that were more than just oral history. They were incantations, warnings. "The land does not forget," she would say, her eyes holding a darkness that seemed to reach beyond her physical form. "And what the land remembers, it will eventually collect." Jacob inherited the family farm in a way that felt more like a curse than a blessing. Nestled in a remote part of the Smoky Mountains, the property was unlike any other. The boundaries seemed to shift. Landmarks that should have been permanent moved in ways that defied rational explanation. Surveys done by different generations showed property lines that could not possibly exist. The first signs that something was different came subtle. Animals would avoid certain parts of the land. Crops would grow in patterns that seemed to form intricate, almost deliberate shapes when viewed from a distance. Local surveyors would return with maps that made no sense, their measurements contradicting everything they thought they knew about geological stability. But Jacob understood something deeper was happening. This was not just land. This was a living memory. Historical records told a brutal story. The Miller family lands had been part of the Cherokee territories brutally seized during the forced removals of the 1830s. Entire families were displaced, murdered, their lands stolen. Through a combination of legal manipulation, outright violence, and governmental complicity, Jacob's ancestors had survived, but survival came with a price. His grandmother's stories were not just history. They were a form of preservation, a way of remembering that went beyond simple historical documentation. She spoke of blood oaths, of promises made to the land itself, of a form of justice that would not be constrained by human understanding of time or morality. As Jacob began to work the land, he discovered artifacts that were more than just historical remnants, carved stones with symbols that predated written language, burial sites that seemed to move, locations where the very air felt charged with a kind of potential energy that defied scientific explanation. Local historians and archaeologists who came to study the property would leave unsettled. Their equipment would malfunction. Their notes would contain inconsistencies. Some would refuse to return, speaking in hushed tones about a feeling of being watched, of being judged. Jacob began to understand that the land was more than just a passive recipient of history. It was an active participant, a witness, a judge. The most disturbing revelations came from the oldest parts of the property, areas where the soil seemed to pulse with a kind of energy that went beyond mere biological processes, areas where the boundary between what was alive and what was memory became dangerously blurred. Old family documents revealed a pattern, generations of Miller family members who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, land disputes that were resolved in ways that defied legal understanding, neighboring property owners who would suddenly sell, abandon, or mysteriously vanish. Jacob's grandmother had prepared him for this. "We are not just inheritors of land," she would say. We are inheritors of a promise, a blood oath that was made long before you were born. The promise, he would learn, was about more than simple revenge. It was about remembering, about ensuring that the true history could not be erased, that the pain of displacement, of genocide, would be remembered in a way that went beyond human comprehension. As months turned into years, Jacob began to understand the true nature of his inheritance. The land was alive, and it was collecting what was owed. Neighboring farmers would speak in hushed tones about strange occurrences, land disputes that would resolve themselves in impossible ways, property lines that would shift overnight, a kind of cosmic justice that operated outside of human legal frameworks. The Miller family lands became something more than a farm. They became a place of reckoning, a living memory of all that had been taken, of all that needed to be remembered. Jacob was not just a farmer, he was a keeper, a witness, an instrument of a justice that predated human understanding. Some stories are meant to be told, some truths are meant to be remembered, and some lands demand to be heard. And this is one of those stories. These are not mere stories. They are warnings carved into the very landscape of Appalachia, etched deeper than geological strata, more permanent than human memory. The tales we've explored, from the blood-soaked coal mines of Harlan County to the misty, forgotten hollows of the Smoky Mountains, are more than narratives. They are living testimonies to the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of human experience. Each story we've uncovered represents a fragment of a larger truth, a horrifying reminder that some memories refuse to be silenced. The Rowland family's generational revenge, the bootlegger's supernatural reckoning, the isolated community's terrifying biological adaptation, the land's vengeful memory. These are not simply tales to be consumed and forgotten. They are echoes of a deeper, more profound horror that exists just beyond the thin veil of our understanding. 80% of you watching this video have not yet subscribed to Verified Fears. This means thousands of viewers are consuming these dark revelations without supporting the channel that risks everything to bring these stories to light. Each narrative we uncover comes at a tremendous cost. Hours of research, sleepless nights digging through archives that most would be too terrified to explore, and a commitment to revealing truths that many would prefer to remain hidden. The stories of Appalachia are not entertainment. They are warnings. They are survival manuals written in the language of human suffering and resilience. Every tale is a testament to the thin line between survival and destruction, between memory and madness. These are stories that hunt, that demand to be heard, that refuse to be contained by the simple boundaries of time or human comprehension. By subscribing to Verified Fears, you're doing more than simply following a channel. You're becoming a witness. You're acknowledging that there are truths in this world far more terrifying than any fictional horror could conjure. You're saying that you're willing to look into the darkness to understand the complex, often brutal mechanisms of human survival. You challenge you to do more than passively consume these stories. Share them, discuss them, investigate the hidden histories in your own family, in your own community. Use the hashtag #VerifiedFearsRevealed and become part of a community that refuses to let these stories be forgotten. Every subscription is a promise. Every share is an act of remembrance. The mountains are watching. The land remembers. And now, so do you. Some stories want to be forgotten. These stories demand to be heard. Verified Fears continues to be the channel where truth proves far more terrifying than fiction, a testament to the darkness that lives not in monsters, but in the very heart of human experience. Subscribe, share, survive.